May 1945. The guns had fallen silent across Europe, but the war's shadow still lay heavy over the fields of Germany and France. The air carried the scent of wet earth and burnt fuel. Smoke coiled lazily above shattered barns, where the echoes of tank engines once thundered. American trucks rumbled down muddy roads, their wooden beds crowded with weary faces. German soldiers, stripped of their weapons, staring blankly toward a horizon they no longer recognized. Among them were veterans of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe, teenagers pulled from Hitler Youth battalions, and even engineers and clerks who had manned the logistical skeleton of a dead empire. They were the defeated army of a nation that no longer existed. Yet, when the news arrived that Germany had surrendered unconditionally, the prisoners expected what every soldier dreads most after losing, a reckoning. They whispered to each other in the back of transport trucks that the Americans would shoot them. They imagined firing squads, forced labor, and starvation. But when they reached the U.S.-run camps scattered across France, Belgium, and the Rhineland, they encountered something that defied every expectation. There were fences, yes, and guards with rifles, but there was also order, cleanliness, and food. Rows of tents lined up with military precision. The smell of bread drifted from field kitchens built by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Water trucks hissed as they filled steel barrels. Loudspeakers announced meal times in slow, careful German. The first night, many prisoners refused to eat, fearing poison. But by morning, hunger won. They were astonished when the guards smiled and handed them cigarettes. The Americans treated them not as beasts, but as soldiers, defeated but human. It was a revelation. After years of propaganda painting the Allies as monsters, the civility of their captors unsettled the Germans more than cruelty could have. One former corporal later wrote that it was like being captured by another planet. At Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, senior officers from the Wehrmacht were processed before interrogation. They expected torture. Instead, they were served coffee. At the massive POW complex in Remagen, thousands of enlisted men lined up for medical inspection, delousing, and clean uniforms. Prisoners who could barely stand were sent to field hospitals. When the word spread that doctors were treating even SS men, disbelief rippled through the camps. The war had taught them to see mercy as weakness. Now, that belief began to fracture. Every morning, they watched American soldiers joke with each other, share rations, and speak casually of home. They saw no hatred in their eyes, only fatigue. For the first time, many realized the scale of the lie they had lived under. But the most shocking moment came weeks later, when American officers announced that the prisoners would soon be released. The war was over. Germany was divided, its leadership gone. "You will be going home," one interpreter shouted through a megaphone at Camp Heilbronn. "The United States will not keep you." For a moment, there was silence. Then confusion spread like wildfire. Men looked at each other in disbelief. Some laughed bitterly. Others shook their heads. Go home to what? There was no home in the West. Allied bombing had flattened entire cities. In the East, the Red Army had advanced with ruthless vengeance. The Soviet camps were whispered about like nightmares, places of starvation, endless labor, and disappearance. Returning prisoners feared being branded collaborators or deserters. Even those from regions now under Soviet control, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, knew their families were gone, their homes burned or annexed. Freedom, for many, meant exile. The Americans tried to explain that international law required repatriation. But among the endless lines of men waiting at the gates, hesitation was everywhere. Some begged to stay. They offered to work for food, to serve as drivers or laborers, or even janitors. Others stood frozen, unable to move when the gates opened at Camp Andernach along the Rhine. Witnesses described hundreds of prisoners refusing to board the trucks meant to take them east. One lieutenant recorded in his journal that they stared through the wire like men awaiting a verdict. For them, captivity, structured, fed, protected, was safer than the freedom that waited beyond. It was a strange sight for the guards. The camps had been designed to hold enemies. Now they were reluctant sanctuaries. U.S. engineers had built them with logistical precision, double fencing with electrified wire, wooden watchtowers, and vast kitchens capable of feeding 10,000 men. The prisoners worked in shifts, some digging ditches, others baking bread or hauling supplies. The discipline that had once served the Reich now maintained the efficiency of its conquerors. And yet, within those fences, something began to change. The Americans noticed how quickly the Germans adapted to order. Within weeks, they organized self-governing committees, assigned work details, and established strict cleanliness standards. When guards entered the compound, they found everything swept, with ration lines perfectly straight. The Americans joked that even in defeat, the Germans could not live without hierarchy. But it was deeper than habit. It was survival. Every evening, under the pale glow of floodlights, prisoners gathered to talk in low voices. They spoke of wives and children, of homes swallowed by fire, of rumors that the Soviets were rounding up anyone with a military record. Some men had not received a letter in months. Others learned through intercepted broadcasts that their towns no longer existed. In the camps, at least, they still belonged somewhere. Reports from the U.S. Army's prisoner of war branch describe officers perplexed by the phenomenon. Many German prisoners exhibit strong reluctance to repatriation, one memorandum noted, citing fear of conditions in occupied zones. Commanders debated policy. Was it moral to force men into a homeland that no longer functioned? Supplies were already thin. The war in the Pacific continued. The Americans needed the camps emptied, but the prisoners clung to the wire that a quiet respect developed between captors and captives. Guards shared cigarettes and stories. Prisoners repaired vehicles, built furniture, and maintained camp generators. They admired American efficiency, the trucks that never stopped running, the endless supplies, and the command structure that seemed both strict and humane. Many began to question everything they had believed about their enemy, a Camp Dermbach. One former sergeant told an American officer, "You fight like engineers, not barbarians." The officer smiled, replying, "We build so we don't have to destroy again." That line, later recorded in a soldier's diary, would echo in the memories of hundreds who heard it. But as the summer of 1945 wore on, the Americans could not delay the inevitable. The camps were to be closed. Repatriation orders arrived. Trucks lined up at the gates once more. The men packed their meager belongings, letters, spoons, and carved wood figures made during idle hours. When the first convoys rolled out, many prisoners turned to look back. They saluted the guards who had fed them, some even shaking hands through the barbed wire. Those who remained behind, waiting for transfer or reclassification, watched in silence. They knew what awaited them, a homeland divided, hungry, and humiliated. The American camps, with their rations and rules, had become temporary nations of order in a continent of ruins by the time the last floodlights dimmed and the fences were dismantled. More than 3 million German prisoners had passed through American hands. For most, captivity was a purgatory between war and peace. But for others, it became something more profound, a place where their understanding of freedom itself was rewritten, because freedom, as they would soon learn, was not simply the absence of wire. It was the absence of fear, and when they stepped beyond those gates into a homeland of ashes, the real battle, the one for identity, for meaning, for forgiveness, was only beginning to uncover why thousands of these men, once indoctrinated in blind loyalty, would rather remain with their captors than return home. We must examine the secret systems of survival, the discipline of the camps, and the strange mercy that turned enemies into reluctant brothers inside the barbed wire world of the American camps. The defeated German army found itself surrounded by a precision it had once prided itself on mastering. The U.S. military had turned efficiency into a language, measured, methodical, and relentless. It was a system built by engineers, not conquerors. The power generators that hummed at night came from Detroit and Buffalo. The prefabricated barracks were products of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The mess hall ovens, capable of baking 2 tons of bread daily, were designed by quartermaster technicians who treated nutrition like mathematics. To men who had lived through the chaos of retreat and ruin, that order felt miraculous. At Camp Heilbronn, electricians from the captured Luftwaffe Signal Corps were asked to maintain lighting circuits. They worked alongside American technicians, passing tools wordlessly, the rhythm of labor dissolving language barriers. The prisoners soon discovered that the enemy's discipline was not born of fear, but of trust. Each man depended on the system, not on ideology. One corporal wrote later that the Americans served rules, not leaders, a sentence that would lodge in his memory long after the war. Every camp ran on a timetable. Reveille at 6, roll call at 7, breakfast at 8. Work details were filled out beneath floodlights that still burned long after dawn. The prisoners built roads, mended bridges, and stacked sandbags. Some harvested crops for nearby French and Belgian farms. Others unloaded railcars filled with supplies for the occupation forces. For the Americans, it was practical, free labor to rebuild Europe. For the Germans, it became a form of redemption through repetition. Shoveling rubble was simpler than reckoning with guilt. The U.S. command soon noticed that these men performed with almost obsessive precision. Supervisors seldom needed to shout. The Germans organized themselves into squads, maintained equipment, and rotated duties without orders. American officers joked that if they looked away for an hour, the prisoners would probably start building a new camp just to keep busy. What the guards didn't see was that structure had become medicine. Behind the neat rows of tents and spotless kitchens hid men terrified of chaos, the same chaos they had unleashed across a continent. The logistics behind this quiet machine were staggering. Each camp was supplied through a web of depots stretching back to Le Havre and Cherbourg. Every loaf of bread, every gallon of diesel, and every spool of barbed wire had a number, a requisition form, and a chain of signatures. American engineers who had built bridges under fire now calculated rations and water flow. In reports filed by the prisoner of war branch, they described the Germans' fascination with this bureaucracy. Men who once worshipped command hierarchy were now learning the gospel of supply chains. Among the prisoners were specialists, mechanics, architects, and scientists. The Americans quietly employed them. Chemists purified water. Draftsmen repaired blueprints for bomb-damaged bridges. Medical orderlies assisted U.S. doctors in field hospitals. A strange camaraderie grew between captors and captives. Skill respected skill. The war had divided nations, but craftsmanship spoke one language. Not everyone adjusted easily. Some officers, still loyal to a dead regime, refused to work or salute the American flag. The guards responded not with punishment, but with indifference, a weapon more devastating than rage. Within weeks, the holdouts found themselves isolated, their arrogance meaningless in a camp that functioned without ideology. Gradually, even they began to join the work details. One former lieutenant would later recall that obedience survived where belief had died. The camps became living laboratories for the psychology of defeat. U.S. Army psychiatrists visited, interviewing prisoners about morale and indoctrination. They discovered a paradox. The men most resistant to Nazi ideology were often the most frightened to leave. Captivity offered clarity, a narrow world where right and wrong were replaced by rules and rations. Outside lay hunger, guilt, and ruin. Inside, there was purpose. By late summer, the lines between prisoners and personnel blurred further. Germans supervised construction crews under American oversight. Carpenters repaired guard towers that no longer needed to be guarded. Musicians formed orchestras. Teachers started makeshift schools. The guards began attending Sunday services led by German chaplains. Cigarettes replaced currency. Friendships formed quietly over shared labor and silence. The Americans themselves were changing. Many were young men who had expected vengeance and instead found pity. They wrote home about disciplined enemies who thanked them for extra bread and about conversations where former foes admitted the futility of the war. Some guards confessed that they no longer felt like victors, only caretakers of a broken generation. Then came the announcement: the camps would close. Orders from Washington demanded rapid demobilization. Trucks lined up once more outside the wire. Loudspeakers repeated the message, "You are going home." But to thousands of Germans, those words landed like a verdict. Home meant rubble, missing families, Soviet patrols, and denazification interrogations. Rumors spread that men returned to the Eastern Zone were vanishing into labor columns bound for Siberia. Panic rose at Camp Andernach. Guards watched as groups of prisoners refused to board transport trucks. They pleaded to stay, offering to dig roads or build barracks. Others stood motionless, arms at their sides, faces pale with disbelief. Some clutched photographs of wives or children they had not seen in years. Others had no addresses to return to. The Americans, bound by regulation, could not accept them. Freedom, they said, was mandatory. One officer remembered the day vividly. They walked to the gate as if approaching the sea. Beyond it was nothing they trusted. The men crossed reluctantly, turning once to salute the guards who had fed them. The camp's flag drooped in the wind. The floodlights were switched off for the last time. For those who remained awaiting transport, the nights grew quieter. The constant hum of generators faded. Crickets filled the silence once drowned by orders and machinery. They had entered captivity expecting brutality and found structure. They would leave it fearing emptiness. Many would later describe the American camps as the safest place we ever knew. When historians pieced together their testimonies decades later, a pattern emerged. These prisoners had not fallen in love with their captors. They had fallen in love with order. The Americans had shown them a system that functioned without cruelty, a discipline rooted in cooperation rather than domination. In its calm efficiency, they glimpsed a world they had been promised but never truly lived in. By the time the last convoys rolled toward the ruined borders of Germany, the lesson was clear. Power, they realized, could exist without fear. And in that realization lay both relief and shame. Because the true captivity was never the barbed wire itself. It was the belief that freedom required chains.
And when those chains finally broke, many discovered they did not yet know how to walk without them. What happened when these men returned to their shattered homeland, and how their months behind enemy wire reshaped Germany's rebirth, would reveal that the greatest transformation of the war was not fought with weapons, but with the rebuilding of the human mind. When the gates of the American camps finally opened for the last time, it was not triumph that met the German prisoners, it was silence. They stepped into a homeland they could hardly recognize, a land split into occupation zones, carved up by the victors like an autopsy of empire. The fields of the Rhineland were barren, the cities skeletal. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of Cologne and Dresden. Rail stations were heaps of twisted steel. Hunger gnawed through the population like a second war. For those returning from captivity, there was no parade, no reunion. Only questions whispered behind closed doors. Where were you? What did you do? They had been gone for months, some for years, and when they returned, the world they had known was gone. The Nazi hierarchy that had commanded their obedience was dismantled. Their officers were in prison or dead. The flags they had saluted were banned. In their place fluttered the standards of their conquerors, the stars and stripes, the Union Jack, the tricolor, and the hammer and sickle. It was as if a new country had risen on the bones of the old. For many former POWs, the adjustment was unbearable. In captivity, they had lived by schedules. Wake, eat, work, rest. Outside the wire, there was only disorder. Ration cards replaced paybooks. Currency was worthless. Town councils were staffed by former enemies. And where the camps had offered structure, post-war Germany offered moral chaos. The line between guilt and innocence was no longer clear. American administrators noted this with surprise. Reports from occupation officers described returning prisoners as disciplined, courteous, but emotionally detached. They moved through ruins with mechanical precision, sweeping debris, salvaging bricks, and rebuilding walls with the same quiet rhythm they had once maintained behind barbed wire. Psychologists called it camp conditioning. It was as though the routines of captivity had become a second skin. Yet that discipline also rebuilt a nation. In the Western zones, U.S. Reconstruction authorities sought stability more than revenge. They needed labor, skilled, reliable, and obedient. The former POWs provided it. They built roads, cleared mines, repaired bridges, and reopened factories under Allied supervision. American engineers who had once guarded them now oversaw their work as partners. What began as necessity became cooperation. The very men who had once feared their captors were now laying the foundation for Germany's rebirth. Among them were technicians who had maintained power systems in the camps. They now wired cities for electricity. Cooks who had fed prisoners organized school kitchens. Doctors who had assisted American medics established rural clinics. The quiet miracle of post-war Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, did not begin in polished offices. It began with men who had learned, in captivity, that order could exist without tyranny. Still, the psychological weight of surrender lingered. Diaries recovered decades later reveal a haunting uniformity, dreams of fences, of roll calls, of lights cutting through night fog. Freedom had come, but many could not feel it. They missed the certainty of captivity, the daily structure, the absence of moral choice. In one letter written in 1946, a former infantryman confessed to his wife, "Out there, I knew what to do. Here, I do not know who I am." The Americans who stayed to administer the occupied zones saw the same emptiness. Army chaplains described returning prisoners attending church services in silence, eyes fixed on the floor. The sermons spoke of forgiveness, but few believed they deserved it. They had served a monstrous cause without seeing its full horror until the camps liberated by the Allies exposed it. Now, the same soldiers who had experienced mercy in American custody faced shame at home. And yet, within that shame, transformation took root. The lessons learned in captivity, discipline without cruelty, cooperation without compulsion, became the moral foundation of a new Germany. Allied education officers established reorientation programs for former POWs, teaching democratic values, civic responsibility, and the rule of law. Many of those men embraced it wholeheartedly. They had seen, with their own eyes, a system that worked through order, not fear. By 1948, as the Marshall Plan poured resources into Western Europe, those same ex-prisoners filled the workforce that rebuilt bridges, factories, and railroads. The barracks routines that had once defined survival became habits of productivity. The men rose early, worked efficiently, obeyed schedules, and kept meticulous records. German industry rebounded faster than anyone predicted. Economists would later call it a miracle. Sociologists would call it muscle memory. The experience also reshaped how nations understood the psychology of war. American military scholars studying POW behavior noted that humane treatment had achieved something force could not: ideological collapse. By feeding, educating, and trusting their captives, the U.S. Army had dismantled the myth of the Reich more effectively than any propaganda leaflet. The German soldiers who had once believed they were fighting for civilization returned home believing they had found it in their enemies. This realization rippled through the Cold War era. When new conflicts arose, in Korea and in Vietnam, the lessons of 1945 influenced U.S. doctrine on psychological warfare and reconstruction. Winning battles was no longer enough. Winning minds mattered more. The story of the German prisoners who refused to go home became a quiet legend within military circles, a testament to the power of discipline joined with mercy. But beneath the strategic lessons lay something human and tragic. The men who stayed behind those fences were not simply reformed, they were hollowed out. Their obedience, once a weapon of empire, had become a shield against uncertainty. They had found safety not in victory or ideology, but in predictability. For them, the American camps were not prisons. They were refuges from chaos, laboratories of conscience where the machinery of obedience was dismantled and rebuilt into something gentler. As the years passed, most never spoke of it. They raised families, worked in factories, paid taxes, and voted. But on quiet nights, when trains rattled past or floodlights swept construction sites, they remembered the camps, the sound of boots on gravel, the smell of diesel and bread, and the strange calm that had followed defeat. Many confessed that the first time they truly felt free was not when the gates opened, but when they realized their captors saw them as men, not enemies. Historians, looking back, would say that Germany's moral reconstruction began not in Nuremberg's courtrooms, but in those American camps. There, amid barbed wire and ration tins, men learned that civilization was not measured by power, but by restraint. It was a revelation born of mercy. Decades later, one former prisoner, now an old man, stood at the site of his old camp near Andernach. The fences were gone, replaced by farmland and silence. He said softly, "Here, I learned what it meant to be human again." That single sentence carried the weight of an entire generation, a generation that had seen both the machinery of destruction and the quiet efficiency of rebuilding, that had known both tyranny and tolerance, and that had learned, through captivity, the hardest lesson of all, that freedom without compassion is hollow, and mercy, even when delivered by the hands of an enemy, can rebuild what war destroys.